Welcome to our deep dive into the life and works of Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe.
You know,
The master of the macabre.
right, Poe, the architect of American Gothic horror, but
Yeah.
today we're going beyond The Raven and the Telltale Heart to explore what made Poe such a giant of literature.
I think it's fascinating how Poe's own life was almost as gothic as his stories.
Yeah,
So to truly understand his work, we need to understand the darkness that surrounded him.
it does feel like his life was a Gothic novel in itself.
It really does.
And I guess it all started with a lot of tragedy early on.
Yeah, Poe's life was marked by profound loss from a very young age.
Really?
His father abandoned the family, and then his mother died of tuberculosis when he was just a toddler.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the impact that kind of loss would have on a young child.
It's heartbreaking. And then he was taken in by John and Frances Allen,
Right.
but that doesn't seem to have brought him much stability.
Well, the relationship with John Allen, his foster father, was complex. While the Allens provided a home, they didn't exactly offer emotional support.
Right.
There were constant financial struggles. Poe often felt the sting of poverty, especially in contrast to the Allens' wealth.
And then, of course, there's the devastating loss of his wife, Virginia Clem, who is also his cousin.
Yeah, Virginia's death in 1847 was a turning point for Poe.
Oh, really?
Her long battle with tuberculosis, much like the loss of his mother, deeply affected him.
Right.
You could see echoes of this pain in much of his writing.
Yeah.
For example, in Annabel Lee, the poem seems to reflect Poe's grief and his idealization of Virginia.
That's interesting. The poem takes on a new dimension knowing that context.
It does.
And it really is striking how often death, grief, and even madness appear in his stories.
Absolutely.
It's as if he's channeling all of that emotional turmoil into his work.
I think Poe's stories are not simply ghost stories or thrillers.
Okay.
They delve into the human psyche.
Okay.
Take The Telltale Heart, for example.
Yeah.
The narrator is driven to murder by an obsession with an old man's eye.
Oh.
Poe doesn't just describe the act. He gets inside the narrator's mind, revealing his descent into madness through a stream of consciousness style that was very innovative for its time.
That's a great example. It's not just the plot, it's the way he writes it.
Exactly.
It's unsettling how he draws the reader into that disturbed mindset.
Exactly. Poe's ability to explore those dark recesses of the human mind makes his work so compelling and disturbing.
And this psychological depth is what sets Poe apart from others during his time.
Absolutely. Poe was exploring themes of guilt, paranoia, and the fragility of the human psyche long before psychology was an established field.
And despite all of this going on in his personal life, he was also trying to build a literary career.
Right. Even as Poe was dealing with personal tragedy and financial instability,
Right.
he was pushing the boundaries of literature. He wrote poetry, short stories, and even dabbled in literary criticism.
I've heard he was quite the critic himself, not afraid to ruffle some feathers in the literary world.
Oh, absolutely. Poe was known for his scathing reviews and sharp wit, which earned him some powerful enemies.
Right.
He publicly criticized some of the most celebrated writers of the day, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Really?
Imagine having the audacity to challenge literary giants during their prime.
That's pretty bold. So here he is trying to carve out a space for himself in the literary world.
Yeah.
But he's simultaneously taking on some of the biggest names in the business.
It's part of what makes Poe such a fascinating figure.
Yeah.
He was a visionary, but he was also a rebel,
Right.
challenging conventions and pushing boundaries which often alienated him from the literary establishment.
But amidst all of this turmoil, there were moments where Poe truly broke through.
Oh,
Or moments where his genius was recognized, even celebrated.
Yes.
Let's dive into those next.
Absolutely. What's remarkable is that Poe didn't just work within existing genres, he revolutionized them.
Okay.
Take detective fiction, for example.
Okay.
Before Poe, the idea of a detective systematically using logic and deduction to solve crimes barely existed.
So you're saying Poe essentially invented the modern detective story?
He laid the groundwork for it, absolutely.
Wow.
Stories like The Murders in the Rue Morgue introduced C. Auguste Dupin, this brilliant, eccentric detective who solved seemingly impossible crimes using his intellect and understanding of human psychology.
Yeah, I've read The Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Okay.
And what struck me was how Dupin solved the case not by brute force, but by careful observation and putting himself in the criminal's mind.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Precisely. That's what makes Poe's detective stories so groundbreaking.
Right.
The focus is on the intellectual puzzle, on the psychological cat-and-mouse game between the detective and the criminal.
And that approach, focusing on the why of the crime rather than just the who, influenced later detective fiction like Sherlock Holmes, didn't it?
Absolutely. You can
Yeah.
see direct parallels between Poe's Dupin and Conan Doyle's Holmes.
Mm-hmm.
Both characters are brilliant eccentrics, masters of observation and deduction,
Right.
who use their intellect to unravel complex mysteries. Poe's influence is undeniable.
It's amazing to think that so much of what we associate with detective fiction today can be traced back to Poe. It's
Yeah,
like he gave us the blueprint for an entire genre.
he really did.
And he didn't stop there, right?
Yeah.
He also made significant contributions to the Gothic genre.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Poe took Gothic elements like darkness, decay, and obsession with death
Right.
and pushed them even further. His poems, especially The Raven, exemplify this.
Yeah, The Raven is just so iconic. That haunting rhythm, the chilling refrain of Nevermore,
Yeah.
it's instantly recognizable even to people who haven't read the poem.
Right.
It's become a part of our cultural consciousness.
The Raven is a masterclass in creating atmosphere.
Yeah.
Poe uses vivid imagery, symbolism, and sound devices to create this incredibly dark and melancholic mood.
Right.
The poem isn't just about a raven, it's about lost grief and the overwhelming presence of the past.
It's interesting that you mentioned the past because one of the things I find fascinating about Poe's work is his exploration of the human psyche,
Uh-huh.
especially how past traumas and guilt can haunt us.
You're right. Poe was fascinated by the dark side of the human mind, long before psychology became a recognized field.
Yeah.
He understood that the mind is capable of great darkness, and he wasn't afraid to show that in his stories.
In The Telltale Heart, for example, the narrator is driven mad by guilt over his crime.
Right.
It's not just a murder story, it's a psychological study of a man unraveling under the weight of his own conscience.
And the way Poe uses language in that story,
Yeah.
the repetition, the fragmented sentences, the focus on the narrator's heightened senses,
Uh-huh.
it all works together to create this incredibly unsettling and claustrophobic experience for the reader.
Right.
We're right there with him, trapped in his madness.
Poe truly understood the power of language to create a specific effect on the reader.
He did.
And this brings us to one of his most important contributions, his impact on the short story as a literary form.
Before Poe, the short story was seen as a lesser form compared to novels.
Interesting.
Poe elevated the short story, arguing that it should be a carefully crafted experience, with every element working towards a single emotional impact on the reader. He called this the unity of effect.
So he was saying that every detail, the plot character's language,
Everything.
should all contribute to that overall effect.
Exactly, and Poe put this theory into practice.
Okay.
In The Fall of the House of Usher, for example, the decaying mansion becomes a symbol of the Usher family's mental and physical decline. Every element of the story, from the setting to the characters' names to the eerie atmosphere, reinforces the theme of decay and impending doom.
So he's not just telling a story, he's carefully crafting an experience designed to have a specific impact on the reader.
Precisely. And that approach to short story writing was incredibly influential. It helped establish the short story as a powerful and respected literary form.
Okay, so Poe is this innovative force in multiple genres.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's a moment, a turning point, where his genius was truly recognized in his own lifetime. I'm guessing The Raven has something to do with this.
You're on the right track. The publication of The Raven in 1845 was a pivotal moment for Poe. It brought him the recognition he had long craved, though unfortunately that recognition was fleeting.
What was it about The Raven that captured the public's imagination?
The poem tapped into something universal. It's about lost grief and the struggle to cope with the overwhelming presence of the past, the dark, melancholic tone, the haunting rhythm and imagery. It resonated with readers on a deep emotional level.
It's amazing to think about this impoverished writer struggling for recognition, suddenly achieving a level of fame with a poem about a raven.
Right.
But as you said, this fame was sadly short-lived.
It was.
And speaking of endings, we can't talk about Poe without addressing the mystery surrounding his death.
Poe's death is almost as shrouded in mystery and intrigue as his stories.
Yeah, it really does add another layer to the Poe legend, doesn't it?
It does.
We were just talking about how Poe achieved some fame with the publication of The Raven,
Right.
and yet his death is this unsolved mystery.
Yeah, in 1849, Poe was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore. He was wearing clothes that weren't his
Wow.
and died a few days later in a hospital. The exact cause of death has never been definitively determined.
It's incredible. There are so many theories about what happened to Poe, everything from alcohol poisoning to rabies.
There's even speculation about cooping, a type of election fraud. where
Wow.
unsuspecting victims were kidnapped and forced to vote multiple times for a particular candidate.
Oh, wow.
But despite all the theories, Poe's death remains a mystery, much like the dark and enigmatic tales he wrote.
It's almost fitting in a way, isn't it? The master of mystery leaving us with one final enigma.
Perhaps the unknown has always held a certain allure, and in a way, it's fitting that Poe's departure from this world would be shrouded in darkness and ambiguity. But what's clear is that even though he's been gone for over 170 years, Poe's legacy continues to thrive.
Absolutely. His influence extends far beyond literature. We see it in film, music, art, even psychology. I mean, even today, so many artists cite him as an inspiration.
He was a true visionary. He tapped into something primal, something deep within the human psyche, and that continues to fascinate and terrify us to this day.
Right.
Think about writers like Stephen King and Neil Gaiman. They both cite Poe as a major influence, and the number of film and television adaptations of his work is astounding.
It's true, you can really see his influence in the work of contemporary horror writers. There's this psychological depth, this willingness to explore the darkest corners of the human mind
Absolutely.
that you can trace back to Poe and the way they use language, creating this sense of dread and suspense. It's very Poe-esque.
Yeah, Poe's work continues to resonate with us because it forces us to confront the darkness, both within ourselves and the world around us.
Right.
His stories may be disturbing,
Yeah.
but they are profoundly thought-provoking.
Right.
They challenge us to explore those shadows and grapple with the complexities of the human condition.
It's like he holds up a mirror to our deepest fears and anxieties,
Yeah.
those things we try to hide from. And yet there's something strangely compelling about facing those fears head on, even if it's through the safety of fiction.
Exactly. There's a reason why we are still captivated by Poe's tales of madness, murder, and the supernatural. Even all these years later, he understood something fundamental about human nature,
Right.
about our attraction to the dark and the unknown.
Edgar Allan Poe, the impoverished writer who struggled for recognition during his lifetime, is now a global icon of horror and suspense. It makes you think, what is it about his work, with all its darkness and disturbing themes, that continues to captivate us all these years later?
Well, maybe it's because Poe's work isn't just about horror. It's about exploring the human condition and all its complexity, both the light and the shadow.
Right.
And maybe that's why even centuries after his death, we're still drawn to the strange and beautiful world he created.
I think that's a great note to end on if you haven't already. I encourage you to explore the works of Edgar Allan Poe. You might be surprised by what you discover, not only about Poe himself, but also about yourself. Each reading reveals new layers of meaning and insight, making his work as relevant and compelling today as it was centuries ago. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.